When history books and glossy films paint a glamorous picture of the Middle Ages, our minds often wander to majestic stone castles where knights in shining armor competed and feasted lavishly in candlelit halls. We imagine flags fluttering, music playing, and laughter echoing. But it is a gilded illusion, a glamorous view enjoyed only by a lucky few. If we peel back the velvet curtain of romance, we are confronted with a much harsher, starker truth, one woven from the lives of the vast majority of people at that time: the anonymous peasants. For them, winter was not a season of festivities and rest, not a time to gather around a warm hearth and tell fairy tales. No, winter is a cruel enemy, an ultimate test of survival that returns every year to test the limits of life. It is an unequal struggle where the contrasts are most stark. While the nobility can wrap themselves in furs and enjoy wine, the peasants face hunger, cold, and perpetual darkness, with only a flimsy wall of mud and a fragile hope that they will see tomorrow's sun. This is not a story of glory on the battlefield, but a silent epic of endurance, of the struggle for every breath in the bitter cold, where survival is not a given, but a great victory paid for with all the strength and will. Try to imagine the place called home, not a sturdy fortress protecting from the outside world, but a fragile living thing breathing with the wind and imbued with the breath of the earth. The medieval peasant's house was built from the most frugal of nature's offerings, a frame of woven branches plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung, a rustic but all-encompassing material that provided a temporary barrier to the cold. But the barrier was tenuous, for the walls did not keep out the wind, but only made its howling more plaintive as it seeped through the many cracks. The thatched roof, though seemingly modest, was a dull, porous sieve, ready to let in the cold rain, and sometimes even to house uninvited creatures. The windows, if there were any, were merely gaps loosely covered with a translucent animal skin, or a rickety piece of wood, enough to distinguish day from night, but not to stop the infiltration of the outside air. And then beneath their feet there was the dirt floor, the bare, damp earth itself, carrying the cold from the earth that seeped into every fiber of their being. In winter, it became a sheet of ice, and when it rained, it turned into a muddy puddle right in the living space. Safety and warmth were luxuries. In their place was a life of naked, unforgiving contact with nature. That fragility still clings to them, even when they retire to rest. The only clothing they have woven from rough wool is only enough to weakly ward off the cold, but cannot really keep them warm. And the bed, the place to seek recovery after a day of toil, is no more than a straw sack, a lumpy, moldy nest, separated only by an insignificant layer from the icy ground. It is in this makeshift space that sleep is not a peaceful stroll into dreamland, but a silent battle to retain every precious bit of body heat. The risk of frostbite or deadly hypothermia is not a distant fear, but a constant companion lurking in the dark, waiting for anyone who lets their guard down in the relentless struggle for survival. Every night that passes is a time when they have to face the truth that the boundary between sleep and eternal death in the cold is as thin as the earthen wall that surrounds them. In the cramped and cold space of the tent, there is a living entity, a heart that always beats with warm and bright rhythms. That is the fireplace. It is not just a spark, but the center of existence, the only source of life when the winter night falls and brings with it the deadly cold. In their world of only two colors, black and gray, the fire from the fireplace is the only source of light, dispelling the darkness and invisible fears lurking within, and at the same time, the only source of heat to warm the shivering bodies and dry the wet clothes. But this heart carries within it a profound paradox. Most of the simple houses do not have chimneys causing the smoke from the firewood to have no way out but to float, linger, and cover the space like a thick layer of fog. That smoke is both friend and enemy. It was pungent, stinging the eyes and seeping into every breath, slowly and cruelly eroding the lungs. Yet that very smoke became an involuntary weapon as it helped drive away fleas and other pesky parasites lurking in the straw, bringing an unwilling cleanliness. Beyond its role as a source of warmth and light, the fireplace was where the family's life converged. It was the kitchen where the only pot of oatmeal of the day was cooked, where the old stories of the ancestors were told to the next generation, where whispers, sighs, and rare laughter were shared. Around that magical circle of light, the whole family drew closer together, becoming a unified block, facing the frozen world outside together. The fireplace was more than a tool, it was the soul of the home, a small, capricious, smoky god, but all they had to keep alive and sustain hope through the long, dark nights. When the night swallowed the last rays of light and the cold became sharper than ever, a silent and all-important ritual took place beside the fireplace. It was not about extinguishing the fire, but about the delicate art of preserving its life, a technique called simmering the fire. To let the fire, the heart of the home, die out completely in the night was an invitation to the icy grim reaper. To start a fire from scratch the next morning, with frozen fingers and in a space as cold as ice, was a nearly impossible task. So, people did not let the fire die, they just lulled it to sleep. With slow, practiced movements, they carefully pile a thick, smooth layer of ash over the glowing embers, like a warm blanket to cover and protect them. This layer of ash will insulate, reducing the amount of oxygen just enough so that the embers do not burn out, but only smolder, retaining the core of heat, a glimmer of life that lasts throughout the long night. This is not a casual job, but an art passed down from generation to generation, a family secret that is more precious than gold or silver. Each family has its own secrets about the thickness of the ash layer, about how to arrange the embers. Sometimes the whole family will have to take turns waking up in the night, not to add more firewood, but just to check, to listen to the faint breath of the sleeping fire to make sure it is still there. The act of keeping a fire going was thus not only a survival skill, it was a symbol of hope, a silent promise that after the deepest darkness, light and warmth would surely return. It was a continuity, an invisible thread connecting the life of yesterday to the dawn of tomorrow, when the warmth of the hearth could only reach a limited distance and darkness and cold still crept into the far corners. Medieval peasants turned to a more primitive and reliable source of heat, life itself. They turned their homes into biological hearths, where the warmth came not from firewood, but from the bodies lying side by side. During the longest winter nights, the concept of privacy vanished like a dream of luxury. The whole family, from the elderly to the young, would gather as one on a common straw bed, woven together like a carpet of flesh and bone. One person's breath warms another's back, and safety comes not from silent walls, but from the heartbeats of loved ones close by. Personal boundaries are blurred not by a lack of civility, but by an urgent need for survival, a most instinctive solidarity against the common enemy of cold. And that warm embrace of community extends to non-human members as well. At night, the livestock are brought indoors, transforming the cramped hut into a chaotic but warm Noah's Ark. The large cow becomes a living wall, radiating a steady and substantial heat source. The goats crowd in, becoming portable woolly heaters, and the chickens seek shelter, adding their own little warmth to the common space. Of course, this arrangement comes at a price. The living space is filled with the stench of animals' waste and dampness. Chaos and unsanitary conditions are inevitable, with grunting, crowing, and shuffling footsteps in the night. But in the harsh calculus of winter, survival warmth is the only thing that counts. The farmers have sacrificed cleanliness, quiet, and comfort for the most precious gift their four-legged friends can give them. Their home is not just a shelter for a family, but an ecosystem of life, a testament to the fact that in the fight against death, all boundaries can be erased, and every creature with warm breath becomes an ally. In the never-ending battle against winter, the human body is the last bastion, and clothing is the carefully constructed wall. Fashion is not a choice, but a strategy where every piece of clothing is designed to preserve warmth. People will wear everything they have, layer upon layer, turning their bodies into fabric onions, hoping that each layer will trap a little air, creating a fragile buffer against the bitter cold. The innermost layer, then a rough sweater, and maybe a worn-out cloak altogether, form an uncomfortable armor that is the only thing standing between them and the cold. And in this logic of survival, a seemingly obvious decision becomes a luxury and a dangerous act: washing clothes. Washing clothes in winter is not a forgotten habit, but a gamble that no one dares to take. It requires exposure to icy water, followed by days of waiting in vain for the only piece of clothing to dry, or worse, watching it freeze into a shirt-shaped block of ice. So people choose not to wash, and from this survival choice, a strange phenomenon arises. Over time, dirt from farm work, soot from fireplaces, and natural body oils gradually accumulate on the surface of the fabric. This filthy film, in an unexpected way, becomes a powerful ally. It fills the tiny gaps in the fabric, making the clothes more airtight, more windproof, and more effective at retaining heat. It is like a natural varnish, a second armor forged from the harshness of life. Therefore, in that world, cleanliness and fragrance by modern standards would be synonymous with weakness and vulnerability, while the smell of smoke, sweat, and soil is the smell of life, a sign of a person who is fighting and surviving. In the never-ending battle against winter, the human body is the last bastion, and clothing is the carefully constructed wall. Fashion is not a choice, but a strategy where every piece of clothing is designed to preserve warmth. People will wear everything they have, layer upon layer, turning their bodies into fabric onions, hoping that each layer will trap a little air, creating a fragile buffer against the bitter cold. The innermost layer, then a rough sweater, and maybe a worn-out cloak altogether, form an uncomfortable armor that is the only thing standing between them and the cold. And in this logic of survival, a seemingly obvious decision becomes a luxury and a dangerous act: washing clothes. Washing clothes in winter is not a forgotten habit, but a gamble that no one dares to take. It requires exposure to icy water, followed by days of waiting in vain for the only piece of clothing to dry, or, worse, watching it freeze into a shirt-shaped block of ice. So, people choose not to wash. And from this survival choice, a strange phenomenon arises. Over time, dirt from farm work, soot from fireplaces, and natural body oils gradually accumulate on the surface of the fabric. This filthy film, in an unexpected way, becomes a powerful ally. It fills the tiny gaps in the fabric, making the clothes more airtight, more windproof, and more effective at retaining heat. It is like a natural varnish, a second layer of armor forged from the harshness of life. Therefore, in that world, Cleanliness and fragrance by modern standards would be synonymous with weakness and vulnerability, while the smell of smoke, sweat, and soil is the smell of life, a sign of a person who is fighting and surviving. Besides the grand survival strategies, the resilience of the farmers is also shown through a world of small creations, quiet wisdom born from misery. The fight against the cold is not only on a large scale, but also in the smallest details. They are masters of improvisation, using whatever is at hand to patch up their fragile shield. A handful of damp moss, a bunch of worn rags, or a bundle of dry grass can also become a faithful sentinel stuffed into the cracks of the wall to block the icy spears of the draft. Every night they check their fortress, a never-ending repair, and when the warmth from the hearth could not reach the straw, they found a way to carry it with them. Smooth pebbles were buried in the hearth until they were saturated with heat, then carefully wrapped in several layers of cloth and placed at the foot of the bed. The stone became a small sun, a second heart of the house, radiating a gentle and persistent heat, driving away the cold of the earth that seeped through the thin layer of straw. Not only did they fight the cold from the outside, they also lit a fire from within. Dinners were not just for filling their stomachs, but also a tactic. They ate solid, energy-rich foods like porridge or black bread, turning their stomachs into slow-burning furnaces, burning calories all night to create heat from within their bodies, an internal fire that fought the cold outside. Finally, when all the defenses had been erected, the battle was brought to the very core of existence, into the very breath. They learned that taking deep, forceful gulps of cold air would damage their lungs and drain them of precious heat. So, even in their sleep, they instinctively regulated their breathing shallowly, gently, and mostly through their noses. It was an unconscious attempt to warm the air a little before it reached the fragile core of life. These small acts, from tucking in a handful of moss, hugging a hot stone, to controlling a breath together, wove an astonishingly complex web of survival, proving that the greatest creativity is sometimes found in the simplest and quietest solutions. When all individual efforts had been exhausted, when the walls still trembled in the wind and the food stocks were running low, the medieval peasant turned to two last strongholds, two invisible sources of strength that helped him overcome the limitations of his body, community, and faith. In the cold of winter, the boundaries between families seemed to dissolve, and the whole village became a single living body, sharing the burden of survival together. Survival was not a solitary battle, but a silent commitment of an entire group. A neighbor was not just someone who lived next door. They were an ally, the last line of defense. When the fire in one house died out, someone from another house would cross the snow carrying a piece of ember carefully wrapped like a treasure, giving not only material warmth, but also the fire of human love. They shared their bread, their precious firewood, and most importantly, they shared their care. The whole community together kept an eye on the houses that seemed quieter than usual, listened to the cough of a child next door, because they deeply understood that the weakness of one member was a threat to the strength of the whole. And when the warmth of human fellowship fails to soothe the fear in their hearts, they turn to another warmth, a source of comfort from the divine. Faith is not a lavish ritual, but an urgent whisper in the dark, a private conversation with God and the saints. Every night before falling into a restless sleep, they kneel in prayer, not asking for wealth, but simply to survive the night. The saints are not distant figures, but intimate guardians invoked to protect their families from the illnesses and disasters that winter brings. They sprinkle holy water in corners of their homes or use blessed chalk to draw protective signs on their doorsteps. These acts, though superstitious, are spiritual anchors, giving them a sense of security and control in an uncertain world. It is the combination of the visible embrace of community and the invisible shield of faith that creates a resilient strength that helps them not only survive physically, but also maintain their humanity and hope, and together go through the darkest winter. Yet in this epic of life, we must also be honest with the saddest notes. Humans do not always win. There are winters when the enemy of ice proves too cruel, and the most valiant efforts are not enough to keep life alive. There are families who fall asleep together, and roofs that become silent forever under the white snow. Death is not a shameful defeat, but a harsh reality, an inseparable part of this battle for survival, and that fact alone makes the victory of those who survive all the more extraordinary. Because the legacy that these anonymous medieval peasants left us is not carved in stone or recorded in golden books, but is etched into the very spirit of humanity. It is a legacy of stubborn resilience, of the will to never give up, no matter how harsh the odds. It is a legacy of creativity born of adversity, of the intelligence that can turn a stone, a handful of moss, into a tool for survival. And it is a legacy of extraordinary adaptability, of learning to live in harmony with a world that was not created to favor them. They were the survivors, the ordinary individuals who quietly won their own daily battles. And it is these small victories repeated over the centuries that together build a solid foundation. They kept the flame of life alive during the darkest nights of history. And from that foundation of resilience, future generations, including us, were able to build a warmer and safer world. Their names may have been erased by time, but their legacy still flows like an underground river that nourishes the roots of civilization. History is sometimes marked by extraordinary individuals, but their extraordinary qualities are not born out of thin air. They are forged in the silent crucibles of youth, shaped by family ambition, and honed by experiences few have ever had. Anne Boleyn was the perfect product of such a process. She did not enter the world with a crown on her head, but with a legacy of ambition running through her veins, from a family of aristocrats who had always aspired to rise up the ladder of power. They recognized early on that their daughter had a different spark, a keen intellect, and a magnetic temperament, and they invested wisely in her future. Rather than keeping her in the familiar surroundings of England, they sent her to the most elite centers of power and culture in Europe at the time. It was in the splendid courts of Holland and then France that Anne was honed. She learned more than the languages and dances of the aristocracy. She learned a far more sublime art, the art of soft power. She observed how clever women use charm, wit, and subtlety to manipulate the most powerful men. She learned how to attract attention without being brazen, how to display intelligence without being seen as arrogant. It was here that Anne was honed from a rough diamond into a perfectly polished weapon. So, when she returned to England, she was no longer the shy, sweet English rose. She returned like a breath of fresh air, carrying with her European confidence a sharp mind and a profound understanding of human nature and politics. She is not only beautiful, but also seductively dangerous, and that difference has become the most powerful magnet ready to attract and change the fate of an entire kingdom. When Anne Boleyn appeared at the English court, she was like a soaring note in a quiet, familiar symphony. Amidst the gentle beauty and humble obedience of noble women, she stood out not only for her dark eyes and confident demeanor, but also for a sharp mind that could turn a trivial conversation into a fascinating battle of wits. She not only attracted the eyes, she challenged the minds of those around her, and the one most strongly challenged was King Henry VIII, a man accustomed to having everything he wanted. The king who saw women as fleeting conquests had for the first time found a worthy opponent, someone who would not easily fall into the arms of power. It was here that Anne made her fateful gamble, a calculated move of almost unimaginable audacity. When the king offered her the position of mistress, a prestigious and powerful unofficial position, she refused. The refusal was not a mere coyness, but a tacit declaration she would not accept a place in the shadows, a supporting role in the king's life. She aimed for the crown, the queenship, or nothing at all. That refusal transformed her from an object of desire into an obsession, a unique prize that Henry had to have at all costs. A king's personal infatuation quickly turned into a political and religious crisis of national proportions known as the Great Matter. To win, Anne Henry was willing to do the unthinkable divorce. Queen Catherine challenged the authority of the Pope and ultimately separate England from the Roman Catholic Church. And so, a rejection uttered by one woman became an echo that reshaped an entire nation, proving that sometimes the fire of history is ignited by a lightning bolt of love and personal ambition. After years of waiting in the shadow of intrigue and promise, Anne Boleyn's gamble finally paid off, in an act that shook the foundations of Christendom. For her sake, King Henry did the unthinkable. He severed centuries of ties with the Roman Catholic Church, established a new church of his own, and cast Queen Catherine, his wife, of 2 decades into the past. In the chaos of the Great Schism, Anne secretly married the king and soon after was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony. It was the pinnacle of her ambition, the moment when all her sacrifice and planning seemed to have paid off. But the glittering crown was heavier than she had imagined, and the throne she had just ascended was terrifyingly precarious. Her position was not built on the love of the people or the recognition of the world, but on one thing, a supreme biological obligation: she must bear the king a son to carry on the line. The whole kingdom, turned upside down by her, now held its breath waiting for news from the royal cradle. All of Henry's power, all of his favor, and even her life were on the line. And then the fateful day came. She gave birth to a healthy, lively child, but it was a girl who would later be known as Elizabeth. In that moment, the atmosphere in the palace must have been heavy with undisguised disappointment. She had given the king a princess when the whole kingdom needed a prince. Anne was queen, but from the first moment of her triumph, she realized that winning the throne was only the opening battle. Keeping it was the real battle, one she faced almost alone with her future, determined by a promise yet to be fulfilled. Like the waxing and waning of the moon, the king's favor had its own cycles, and for Anne, the golden age was fading irrevocably. The foundations of her power, built on a single promise, began to crumble in the royal bedchamber. The subsequent miscarriages were not only personal tragedies, but also fatal blows to Henry's love and patience. Each crushed hope for a prince further eroded the king's passion, turning it from a blazing flame to cold ash. And as Henry's gaze began to tire, it found a new resting place. Jane Seymour, a lady of gentle beauty, quiet, and most importantly submissive, in stark contrast to Anne, who was increasingly sharp and fierce in her efforts to maintain her position. Jane's rise was not the cause, but the symptom that the king's heart had changed, and he was looking for a way out. As the rift appeared, Anne's enemies who had been lying in wait began to act. Led by Thomas Cromwell, who had been her closest ally, A web of intrigue was quietly and deadly spun. Cromwell, with the mind of a practical politician, realized that Anne had become a hindrance, a queen too strong, too independent, and no longer useful. The way out for the king could not be a scandalous divorce. It had to be a complete and utter removal, and so the most horrible, most absurd accusations were made not to seek the truth, but to destroy a person. They accused her of adultery with multiple men, and most disgustingly, of incest with her own brother. They accused her of conspiring against the king. These were verbal stabs designed to assassinate her character before the executioner took her life, transforming her from queen to demon in the eyes of the public. The siege was closed not by a single enemy, but by a combination of fate, dead love, and political ambition, and the brightest star of the Tudor court began her journey into darkness. The final stage of Anne Boleyn's life was not a splendid court, but a cold courtroom, where justice was a supporting role in a play whose script and outcome had already been written. Her trial was not a search for truth, but a meticulously choreographed performance to validate a decision that had already been made. Faced with absurd accusations and the cold eyes of those who had owed her favors, Anne did not collapse. She fought not with a sword, but with her sharpest weapons, her mind and words. She calmly and logically refuted each accusation, exposing the contradictions in the testimony of witnesses. In that moment, she was not a desperate defendant, but a queen defending her honor for the last time. But all efforts were in vain, for her words only echoed in a space where the truth no longer had any value. The verdict of guilty was declared as a matter of course, and the death penalty was decided. During her final days in the Tower of London, Anne showed extraordinary courage and calm. She stopped struggling and began to accept and prepare for her departure. She spent her time praying, comforting her weeping ladies in waiting, and even joking bitterly about her small neck and the skill of her executioner. It was the serenity of one who had seen through the lies of the world and found peace in her faith. And then, on the morning of May 19th, 1536, she walked to the scaffold with unshaken dignity. She did not curse her enemies, did not accuse the king, but prayed for him and for the kingdom. The sword of the French executioner flashed once in the air, quick and silent as a sigh. Her body was destroyed, but by facing death so nobly, Anne won the final and most important battle, the battle for her legacy. Her final image, a queen wronged but still holding on to her dignity, was immortalized. Death seemed to have ended Anne Boleyn's story, erasing her from the pages of history. But history has a way of writing its final chapters, and a person's legacy is sometimes most vivid after they have died. Anne's enemies may have removed her body, but they could not extinguish the two great legacies she had unwittingly sown, legacies that would shape England for centuries to come. The first legacy and the sweetest vindication of fate lies in the form of the daughter she was considered a failure when she gave birth. Elizabeth, the little princess considered a disappointment, grew up to become Queen Elizabeth I, one of the greatest, wisest, and most beloved monarchs in the entire history of England. She inherited not only the throne, but also the sharp intellect, strong will, and indomitable spirit of her deceased mother. During her golden reign, Elizabeth took England to new heights of power and culture, and each of her successes was an affirmation of the value of Anne Boleyn's bloodline. The woman executed for not being able to give birth to a king ended up being the mother of a queen greater than any king. Her second legacy was even more profound, deeply ingrained in the soul of the English nation. Although Anne's original purpose was only personal ambition, Her ascension to the throne inadvertently sparked a revolution. It was because of her that Henry VIII had launched the Reformation, separating England from Roman control and giving birth to the Church of England. This religious earthquake forever changed the political, social, and cultural life of an entire nation. In the end, Anne Boleyn, the queen who lost the battle for her life, won the battle for her legacy, leaving an indelible mark, both personal in the image of her daughter and epical in the transformation of an entire kingdom. Revolutions never start from a single spark. They are like a teapot set on a slow fire where discontent builds up drop by drop until it can no longer be contained. The relationship between Britain and its American colonies in the 1770s was such a teapot heating up by the day. The fire had been lit years earlier when a distant parliament in London began imposing taxes on the colonists without giving them a voice or representation. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Each new piece of legislation was like a log added to the raging fire. The issue for the American people was not the amount of tax they were paying, but a deeper principle and affront to their dignity, the right to self-determination. They believed they were being treated as subjects to be exploited, not as respected citizens of an empire. That simmering resentment turned to open hostility on a winter day in 1770 when shots rang out in the streets of Boston. The Boston Massacre, when British soldiers opened fire on civilians, had become an indelible scar. The ink on the protest notes had been replaced by blood on the cobblestones. Trust already fragile had been shattered. The relationship between mother country and colony had become less familial than distrust between ruler and ruled. The political atmosphere had become thick-heavy with unspoken resentment and clenched fists. A whole generation of Americans was growing up feeling oppressed, and the flame of freedom had begun to burn in their hearts, waiting for the slightest breeze to ignite a storm. And that wind was coming, carrying the scent of distant tea leaves. Faced with a growing fire of discontent, the British government chose not to extinguish it with understanding, but with what it believed was a clever move, a move calculated to both save the economy and reassert its authority. The Tea Act of 1773 was enacted, and on the surface it looked like a gift, a generous concession. By allowing the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing the middleman, the price of this luxury beverage was dramatically reduced. It was a tempting offer and economic appeasement, with the hope that the colonists would happily accept the bargain. But behind the sweet gift was an elaborate trap, a poison coated in sugar. The Tea Act lowered the price of the product, but deliberately retained a small tax, the Townshend tax, which had been the source of all the controversy. The colonists saw through the ploy immediately. They understood that this was not simply a matter of buying a cup of tea. Accepting the cheaper price was tacitly acknowledging that the British Parliament had the right to impose taxes on them. It was a test of their loyalty to principle, a test of whether their liberty could be bought for a few pennies. For them, the price was not the price of a barrel of tea, but the price of dignity and self-determination. And so, the teapot that Britain intended to appease became the most visible symbol of oppression, in disguise a challenge that the Sons of Liberty could not ignore. Once the trap was sprung, Boston responded not with panic, but with organized calm and determined resistance. Led by those who called themselves the Sons of Liberty, a wave of disobedience swept through the city. They were not an anarchist mob, but principled citizens, conductors of a symphony of defiance. Meetings were held, oaths were taken, and an iron resolve was formed. Not a single leaf of British East India Company tea would be allowed to be unloaded in this port. Facing that wave of anger was a solid wall of royal authority embodied in Governor Thomas Hutchinson. He was the king's law-abiding man, and to him, yielding to popular pressure meant a collapse of order. He refused to allow the 3 tea ships to turn back, forcing them to anchor in the harbor, making them silent hostages in an increasingly dangerous confrontation. And so, a perfect stalemate was created. On shore, the colonists refused to let the tea be unloaded. In the water, the governor refused to let the ships leave. Time was no longer an ally, it had become a jailer, counting down to the 20 days stipulated by law, when the government would have the right to seize the cargo by force, and the tax would be paid by default. With each passing day, the tension grew tighter, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Boston became a silent theater, waiting to see which side would falter first, or whether the thread would snap in a fateful act. As the final words at the Old South Meeting House faded into the cold December night, everyone knew that the time for debate had passed, and the time for action had come. A group of men quietly separated from the crowd, and in the darkness of the alleys, they performed a ritual of disguising themselves. They smeared their faces with soot, covered themselves with blankets, and pinned on feathers a simple disguise as Mohawk Indians. The act was not intended to conceal their identities, for, in a small city like Boston, everyone knew each other. It had a deeper symbolic meaning. It was a declaration that they were no longer law-abiding British subjects, but something more primitive, more wild, a spirit of the American land itself, untamed or unconquerable. Then they marched into Griffin Harbor, not as an angry mob, but as a disciplined army on a silent march. No shouts, no curses, just the pounding of footsteps on the cobblestone streets. They boarded the 3 ships in an almost eerie silence, sweeping the crews aside without injuring anyone. Their goal was clear and singular. Only the tea, the visible symbol of oppression, was to be destroyed. With decisive blows of their axes, they smashed the wooden crates one by one, and then 342 heavy crates of tea were thrown into the dark water of the harbor. The only sound that broke the silence of the night was the cracking of wood and the heavy splash as the crates sank. No one took a single leaf of tea, no other cargo on board was touched. It was not a raid, but a ritual of political cleansing. That night, Boston Harbor became more than just a giant teapot. It became the cradle of a revolution where a silent act echoed louder than any declaration of war. The crash of the tea chests into Boston Harbor sent ripples across the Atlantic, and by the time they reached London, they had become a storm of fury. To King George III and the British Parliament, the Bostonians' actions were not a protest, but an unforgivable rebellion, a public blow to imperial pride. London's response was not dialogue, but a determination to punish ruthlessly, setting an example for the other colonies. Britain, playing the role of a stern father, had decided that the softness was over, and iron discipline had to be imposed. And so, a series of harsh laws known to Americans as the Intolerable Acts were enacted. They were designed to choke the life and crush the spirit of Boston. The port of Boston, the city's economic lifeline, was closed. Massachusetts's self-government, which it had cherished for generations, was stripped and placed under direct royal control. The British believed that by isolating and punishing its leader, they would frighten the rest of the colonies into submission. But their calculation was fatally flawed. A whip wielded to punish one son often brings the other sons together in fear and sympathy. Instead of fear, the other colonies saw Boston's fate as a prophecy of their own future. They understood that if Boston fell today, Virginia, Pennsylvania, or Carolina would fall tomorrow. Boston's pain became a common pain, and Britain's punishment inadvertently became the glue that held the 13 colonies together. For the first time in their history, they acted as a united body. The First Continental Congress convened, where delegates from all over the world sat together, not as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as Americans with a common purpose. Britain had wanted to put out a spark in Boston, but it had not expected that its actions would fan that spark into a conflagration that would spread across the continent. If history is a series of events, then the Boston Tea Party was the spark, the moment when a small spark became a blazing torch, lighting the way for a revolution. The act of throwing tea into the sea was not simply a protest against taxes, but an act of symbolic defiance, a definitive declaration that the era of paper protests was over. It transformed the nature of the struggle from a desire to reform a system to a will to overthrow that system. It was no longer the plea of a child wanting to be heard, but the declaration of a grown child determined to forge his own path. From that fateful night, an irreversible chain of events was set in motion. Defiance in Boston led to brutal retribution from London. Retribution from London led to unprecedented unity among the 13 colonies. And that unity led to militias being formed and arsenals being built in the peaceful countryside. So, when the British marched on Lexington and conquered, intent on disarming the people they encountered, not frightened farmers, but armed citizens ready to fight for their rights in their homes. The first shots of the American Revolutionary War, fired over the bridge at Concord, were a direct echo of the sound of tea barrels sinking into the cold waters of Boston Harbor. That silent act of night not only destroyed a company's goods, but also destroyed any last hope of a peaceful reconciliation, sparking a war that would give birth to a new nation. In the vast annals of human history, there are chapters that have been forgotten, covered by the sands of time, until they have almost disappeared, only a whisper in the wind. The story of Corral is such a chapter. Long before the Incas built Machu Picchu, before the Maya erected their temples in the jungle, an extraordinary civilization rose and flourished quietly in a dry valley in what is now Peru. Nearly 5,000 years ago, at the same time that the pharaohs were ordering the construction of the Great Pyramids at Giza, and the first cities were sprouting in Mesopotamia on the other side of the world, Corral was already a complex, brilliant, and organized metropolis. Yet, after reaching its peak, Corral faded away and fell into a sleep so long it seemed to last forever. Over the millennia, its stone pyramids were eroded by the desert sands, turning into gentle, silent hills that passers-by thought were part of the natural landscape. The memory of it was completely erased. It was not until the end of the 20th century when archaeologist Ruth Shady, with a scientific skepticism, began excavating those silent hills that the world was stunned to realize the secret they were hiding. The discovery of Corral was more than just an ancient relic. It was an earthquake that shook our entire understanding. It proved that the Americas were not a new world that only knew civilization late, but also one of the oldest cradles of human society. Corral was no longer a silent hill. It has raised its voice a whisper from the depths of the past, forcing us to listen and rewrite from scratch what we thought we knew about the origins of civilization. What makes Corral so amazing is not just its age, but how it was built, a testament to the human mind's ability to surpass all technological limitations. In the middle of a desolate desert, They built massive stone pyramids, circular plazas sunk into the ground like sacred wells, and intricately planned settlements. And most amazingly, all of this was accomplished without the wheel to move, without metal tools to cut, and without a writing system to record their plans. Their power came not from technology, but from the cooperation of a community and a collective will that could move mountains. Unlike the pyramids of Egypt, which were great tombs dedicated to the dead and honored the pharaohs, the structures of Corral were oriented toward the living. They were not burial places for the dead, but rather stages for the living centers of ritual, political, and social activity. At the top of these pyramids, people gathered to perform rituals under the stars, and in the circular plazas, whole communities participated in festivals. Their architecture served to unite, creating spaces for people to come closer together. And in the silence of the stones, one discovered a deeper wisdom. Corral is located in an area prone to earthquakes, yet its structures have withstood the test of time. That's because the ancient builders developed sophisticated earthquake-resistant construction techniques using flexible foundations and materials that could absorb and disperse shocks. It is not just about technology, it is a silent dialogue with the earth, an understanding and respect for the power of nature. The stones of Corral still lie there, telling not about kings or conquests, but a deeper story, the story of a community that came together to build their dream with their bare hands, with their will, and in harmony with the universe. Perhaps the most astonishing discovery at Corral was not what people found, but what they are not found. Amidst the monumental architecture and complex social organization, archaeologists have not discovered any signs of war. There are no towering walls to defend against enemies, no arsenals, and no images of conquered warriors or prisoners on the stones. The silence of this violence is its most unique feature, its gentlest whisper from the past, telling us of a very different path of development. The Corral civilization seems to have been built not on swords and fear, but on the foundations of cooperation, of shared faith, and especially of trade. Commerce was the lifeblood, the river that fed Corral's prosperity and peace. They had created a clever and mutually beneficial network of exchange. The people of the valley grew cotton and other crops, then traded them with coastal communities for dried fish and precious seafood. It was a perfect symbiotic relationship, where each side gave what it had in excess and received what it lacked. This economic bond bound the different communities together, making maintaining peace not just a moral ideal, but a practical benefit. War would disrupt the trade network, and that would harm everyone. In addition, the large plazas and communal ceremonies revealed a society bound together by a strong faith and cultural identity where strength came not from conquering others, but from coming together and being in harmony with one's own people. Carol whispers to us through 5,000 years that a great civilization need not be built on blood and conquest, but can be nurtured by exchange, respect, and the desire to live together in peace. If architecture is the skeleton of Corral, then the spiritual and social life is the soul, the beating heart that once made this stone city come alive. In a society without an army to rule by fear, cohesion had to come from another source of strength, one woven from shared rituals and music. Sound seems to be the primary language of Corral. Archaeologists have found an astonishing collection of musical instruments, especially flutes exquisitely crafted from the bones of vultures and pelicans. Listen in the silence of the desert, and you can imagine the haunting, melodious tones of these bone flutes echoing through the squares on a late afternoon, a prayer in sound to the gods of the mountains, rivers, and sky. Music was more than entertainment. It was part of the ritual, a link between humans and the spiritual world. And the stage for these symphonies and ceremonies was the sunken circular plazas, a unique architectural design. They were not ordinary open spaces, but cosmic amphitheaters deliberately built to converge the sounds and focus the attention of thousands of people on a central point. This was where the whole community came together, experienced together, and strengthened their common identity, transforming the individual into a harmonious whole. In addition to the rich spiritual life, people also found evidence of a highly organized society in a mysterious relic, the strings Huipu. This is an intricate system of knots on multicolored strings believed to be a form of coded language for recording information from trade figures to astronomical calendars to historical narratives. Carol teaches us that a society does not need writing to be complex, nor weapons to be orderly. Sometimes harmony can be found in a piece of music, in a shared ritual, and in the wisdom woven from strings and knots. Every symphony must come to an end, and the great city of Caral, after centuries of prosperity, came to its end as quietly as it had lived. There were no broken walls, no traces of a final battle, no mass graves. Caral was not destroyed by an external enemy. It seemed to have simply melted into the desert as its people quietly departed, leaving their empty squares to the sands. Caral's enemy was probably not an invading army, but the changing landscape and the passage of time. Scientists believe that a prolonged climate change causing severe droughts dried up the river and made agriculture unviable. At the same time, the rise of new centers of power with different trade routes may have weakened Caral's central role. The economic and natural foundations that had been delicately balanced eventually collapsed, forcing people to seek new, more promising lands. Caral's body may have returned to dust, but its spirit and message have resonated through the millennia, becoming its most precious legacy. Caral's greatest legacy lies not in its pyramids or its artifacts, but in the great question it poses to all of humanity, are war and conflict. The only way to achieve greatness, Caral, by its peaceful existence, powerfully challenged the popular notion that civilizations can only be built on conquest and military power. It is a historical testament, a gentle reminder that even in its earliest days, humans had the intelligence and potential to build complex societies based on cooperation, trade, and mutual respect. It is an echo from the past, telling us that peace is not a utopian dream, but a completely possible choice, and that its seeds still exist waiting to be planted even in the driest deserts.